Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
We're very glad to have with us one of the leading lights of reinforcement learning right in our backyard, so to speak. Professor B. Ravindran from the Computer Science Department at IIT Madras. He did his PhD at University of Massachusetts Amherst with the very well-renowned Andy Bartow, who is, I believe, now not teaching anymore.
He's retired.
He's retired, yeah. But nevertheless, so that whole school of reinforcement learning essentially evolved from Andy Bartow and several of his students and their students and so on. We are very glad to have Professor Ravindran among us. And he'll be basically taking you through what is probably relatively new in this summer school, which is the entire subfield of reinforcement learning. And I'm sure he'll have several really interesting ideas and things to tell us. So with that, I hand it to
Thank you, Aditya. And so good afternoon, everyone. And so now that I know that not too many people know about reinforcement learning, I'm at liberty to say whatever I want. So I'm going to, I originally had intended to do a more in-depth session on scaling up reinforcement learning, but what I'm going to do now is have a slightly longish tutorial introduction to what reinforcement learning is, right? And then in the second half, after the break, maybe talk a little bit about scaling up issues. Okay, and so this is I've borrowed several slides from Rich Sutton and Andy Bartow, whose textbook is the most popular textbook on reinforcement learning. Kind of easy to read. I mean, read by yourself. Bedside read kind of a book. So I've borrowed many slides from them, and then let's see what we get from there, right? So you have been most of you have been exposed to familiar models of machine learning, like supervised learning, and most of the talks so far have been on things like classification, regression, and so on and so forth. And I'm pretty sure people are familiar with unsupervised learning, like clustering, frequent pattern mining, and other things. So I have a question for you folks. How did you learn to cycle? Was it supervised learning or unsupervised learning? Unsupervised. Supervised. Semi-supervised. Okay. So we haven't really had any talks on semi-supervised learning so far? Not really? Okay. So semi-supervised actually has a very specific connotation in the machine learning community. So where you work with data, it's essentially a supervised learning problem, but then the training data that is available to you, only partly it's labeled, right? So the rest of it is unlabeled. So can you use the unlabeled data to learn well? So that's what semi-supervised learning is all about. So if you say that you learned cycling through supervised learning, right? So how was the training data given to you? Right? Did somebody say that, okay, if your cycle is tilting at 33 degrees to the vertical and you are moving forward at 4 miles per hour, this is what you have to do, right? So did people give you training examples of that sort, and from that you managed to generalize how to learn to cycle? If you had actually tried that, you would probably never ever get on a cycle, right, in your life. And if you think it is unsupervised learning, so did you learn to cycle by just watching a lot of people cycle before you, right, figuring out what patterns are repeating, right, in their cycling gait and stuff like that, and try to reproduce it? No, right? So what distinguishes learning to cycle from any of the commonly known modes of learning? It's essentially trial and error, right? Unless you try to cycle, okay, and you know what is failing, right? So you have to explore, right? So you have to try out different things, okay, and only then you will learn how to cycle. If you just try to read a book and learn to cycle, it never works. Okay, It's because cycling is very complex. I mean, but then there are a whole bunch of other things which fit into this general framework. A lot of everyday learning that you do, or a lot of learning that humans do, right, kind of fall into this kind of trial and error setup. You know? Starting from baby is learning to talk. Right? So people might argue that talking is supervised learning. You watch all your parents talk and then you try to do that yourself, right? But you don't have access to your parents' vocal cords. Right? So you can't measure how they are actually producing those sounds. Right? So you have to try it yourself. You might be able to hear the sound that your parents are producing. So you might want to reproduce the same thing, but you have to try these things yourself. Right? So trial and error learning. And so I'll take a lot of examples from human learning, animal learning along the way, because that's one of my strong motivations to get into this whole field of reinforcement learning, because it's very strongly biologically motivated. Right? So you have some kind of feedback. It's not completely without any feedback. You know that falling down hurts, so you really don't want to fall down, right? Hopefully, I mean, if there are masochists, maybe you'd like to fall down, but then you'll probably learn how to ride your cycle at a very high speeds into walls, or something like that. So whatever it is, so by trial and error, you can figure out what behavior you want to achieve with the cycles, right? So let's take a simple example of it. So let's look at something like running a maze, you know. So they have, it's like training a mouse to run a maze, and then you give it some kind of reward, you know, some quantity of cheese at the end of it. So then you know that it learns to run the maze in the proper way that you are looking at, right? So how would you like it to run the maze here? So what is it? What is the behavior that you are trying to achieve? Right. So when it is at A, it needs to go left, right, and reach B, and when it is at B, it needs to go right, and then it gets a high reward. Okay, if it flips that, instead of going left right, it goes right left. Also, it's not too bad. Okay, you get some reward. But if you go right, left and right, you get nothing. Okay, so you would ideally like it to learn to go left and go right. Right? But then what's happening? The mouse is essentially running the maze at random. So the first time the mouse runs the maze, it could very well go left and end up getting nothing. Right? And what do you think the mouse would learn? If don't go left. Right? Left is bad. And then what it's going to do? Next time it's going to go right, and maybe randomly it goes left, and it gets a reward of 2, which is like a small quantity of a nibble of cheese, and it's very happy. Like, oh God, I got some cheese, and then it just keeps sticking to it. The next time you put it in the maze, it goes right, it goes left. Right? It's got stuck in some kind of a local optima. Right? So you have to keep exploring in the world. You shouldn't be just happy with some small amounts of reward that you get along the way. You have to keep exploring until you get to the ideal solution, or until you are satisfied that whatever solution you have is not too bad, not too far away from what is optimal. Right? And things can get more complicated in real life. So somebody might spill some oil in the maze while they are trying to set things up. So the mice tries to go left, it skids and then ends up going to the right end of the maze, right, with some probability. So it thought it went left, but it ended up in C. So the mouse can get all confused, right? And also it could very well be the person setting up the maze that day felt a little extra hungry and nibbled the cheese themselves instead of putting it down there. So in which case there is no cheese for it to find, even though it knows exactly, oh, this is what I need to do. It has learned the behavior, go left, go right, I'll get cheese, and suddenly one day it doesn't find the cheese. So what should it do? Should it give up? Right? Again, try it again. Right? The next day probably the people are not that hungry and it gets the cheese. Right? So these are essentially some of the issues that we have to deal with in solving reinforcement learning problems. Right? So first thing is the choices that you have to make have to be tied in with the inputs that you are getting. Right? So the choice you make at A is different from the choice you make at B. Right? The second is you have to explore. Right? So you can't decide on the first time you get a reward, you can't decide that that's the best and you can't stick with it. Right? And then the third thing is you have to worry about stochasticity in the world. Right? So you might have to draw a lot more samples than what you would normally think or needed. Right? So a bunch of things. So has it been used elsewhere other than cycling? Well, by us and all these kinds of simple explanations. I'm going to walk you through some I don't know, so like the marquee applications of RL, and then get down to the brass tacks, right? So that so one of the initial success stories of reinforcement learning was in playing this game called backgammon. So how many of you know about backgammon? How many of you know what's the thing? Ludo. Okay, so think of playing Ludo instead of a cross-shaped board. Okay, so you play in a board that looks like this, right? So this is only 2 colors instead of 4 colors. Okay, and you have a lot more pieces. So you have 30 pieces instead of only 4 or whatever. Right, but the objective of the game is same. You roll the die, you move your pieces around the board, and then you manage to take them off the board. Right. So along the way, you can actually hit the opponents. So you can basically cut that fellow's coin and then send him back to the base, and all of those things which you can do. Right. It's given the number of pieces that you have and the fact that there is a die roll that is involved in this, it makes it a very complex game for traditional AI agents to play. Right. So AI search-based solutions for backgammon have been notoriously bad. So what Jerry Tesoro did was in the late 80s, he built this computer program called NeuroGammon, which essentially used neural network, used supervised learning, and trained the neural network to play backgammon. So Jerry himself is a pretty decent player of backgammon. So he was the expert who said, okay, if this is the board position, if this is the die roll that you have, this is how you should move your pieces. So he trained the agent like that, and then at some point it became the best computer player of backgammon. Okay. And then he came across reinforcement learning. Okay. Then he said, okay, let me try using reinforcement learning for the same thing. So he didn't do anything very different. He took the same neural network. So instead of using supervised learning, he used reinforcement learning. Okay. So he set it up so that the program can play against itself, right? And then let it play like millions of games. So the number of games that you could now play is unimaginable, is unbounded basically, because you don't really need any kind of supervision. You don't need a human to tell it what is the right move and so on and so forth. It just plays against itself and discovers something, and it ended up becoming the best player of backgammon. Okay, not the best computer player of backgammon. It actually entered into a match with the best human players. Okay, in fact, there is a world championship of backgammon. Okay, it's a very popular game, especially in the Middle East. And it actually beat the human champion. I think it was in '95. I didn't look up the date, but I think it was in '95. So it's a pretty powerful technique. So I'll tell you a little bit about how this whole thing was set up. And more recently, so this guy is David Silver. Right now he heads Google DeepMind. It's a machine learning research group. So he, during his PhD, built a reinforcement learning agent that plays the game Go. Okay, so for people who, how many of you know about Go? One. My God. Okay, how many of you know about Othello? A few more. Okay. This is Linux game, right? I mean, so if anybody working with the Linux system, there are like only 3 games you can play on that, right? One of them is this. I think it's called Reversi or something on the Linux, the GNU distributions. Anyway, fine. So it's a game where you have to essentially dominate the board, right? So you have to make sure that the majority of the board has the pieces of your color as opposed to opponent's color. And Go is like this really large-scale version of it, and it's very difficult to play. Right? So it has often been considered one of the hardest game problems for classical AI techniques to solve, and so David came up with something that's not exactly pure reinforcement learning, but it combines reinforcement learning aspects in game search, and came up with a pretty decent player of Go. Right? And so, does that face look familiar to people? Okay, yeah. So he's a celebrity, but before he became a celebrity, he did something which made him a celebrity in reinforcement learning. Essentially, he built a reinforcement learning agent that learns to fly a helicopter. Okay, that's being flown autonomously by an agent that learned how to fly it. Not exactly from scratch. It had a pretty decent model to begin with, but it can do all kinds of funky tricks. In fact, I think part of this work was done by one of Andrew's students, Peter Abel, but it's still an impressive thing. So it's I know about the, it's a helicopter about 2/3 the size of this table. It's not a full life-size helicopter, but still it's pretty impressive the things that they can do with it. And people have done more funky things with it. I was trying to get some good resolution videos for this, but I couldn't. So the thing is, people must have heard of RoboSoccer, right? So which is a competition that has been running for a couple of decades now, and they have different variants of it. They actually have real humanoids play this. They used to have a small robot league where they had all this Sony IBOs play that. They had to shut down the small robot league because Sony stopped making the IBOs. If among all the bad decisions that Sony would have ever made, and stopping the IBO was the one that's the worst. Anyway, fine. So what this group from UT Austin, which under Peter Stone, they have been repeat champions in different versions. They actually with the real humanoids they have won multiple times. With simulated league they have won multiple times, and this is their latest thing which they have been really kicking ass is in this 3D humanoid simulation leagues. Okay, so the last 2 years they have won without conceding a single goal through the entire tournament. Okay. And a lot of the actions and a lot of the small maneuvers that these agents make were learned using reinforcement learning. Okay. So it's not an end-to-end reinforcement learning system because quite a bit of visual processing had to be done. So there a significant computer vision component built into it. But then, so Peter uses something called layered learning, where different layers of the problem can be solved using different learning techniques. Quite often reinforcement learning at multiple layers, but there are some layers where a completely different kind of approach would be suited. So they did really well with that, right? And so then there's something on online learning which I think Aditya is going to talk more about. But some form of reinforcement learning or the other has been used in things like selecting ads to display to people, and in customization. Like so, this is an example from Yahoo News. At one point, Yahoo was actually using a reinforcement learning engine to pick which news items to show to you on the front page when you land at Yahoo News. And yeah, so I'm assuming I just committed you to that on the slide. Okay. So what is reinforcement learning here, right? So in all of these things, if you think about it, the crucial component is, so there is an environment, right? So it could be the opponent team in a RoboSoccer or the wind and other conditions when you are flying the helicopter, right? And so you have the environment and you have a learning agent, right? And they act in pretty close interaction. So the agent senses the environment, okay, senses the state the environment is in, right? And then it responds with an action, okay, something. So it could be a move in the game, right? Or it could be a joystick control in your helicopter, right? Whatever it is, you respond with an action, and that causes the state of the environment to change. So this is essentially a closed loop interaction. So if you think of it in like machine learning terms, this makes it very different from classification, because in classification you don't select, typically you don't select what's the next input that you're going to get, right? So there is this distribution from which your inputs are being drawn, and you're just being presented those inputs that have been selected from the distribution. But here you have this thing where you take an action. Okay, not only not only is it a response to the state that you sensed, but it also causes a change to the environment so that it affects the next problem that you're going to have to solve. Right? So in some sense, you have to be solving this sequence of decisions. Right? So that's one of the things that we looked at. And so once you take an action and apply it to the environment, you might or might not get some kind of an evaluation from the environment. The helicopter might crash. Yeah. So let's say I'm flying a helicopter, and my action is to move my steering wheel, or whatever, steering joystick a little bit to this side. So my helicopter is actually going to tilt, or it's going to fly in a different direction. So whatever the control is doing, right? So immediately that causes a change to the state of the helicopter. Right? Or let's say you're playing a game, you make a move that causes the change to the board position. So whatever actions you take cause a change to the environment in which you are operating.
So here agent continuously senses the state of
Agent continuously sends the state of the environment. Sure.
Then based on the information, it will take a decision to which action it has to take. There is some set of actions.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'll formalize it as we go along, but this just to give you the intuition as to what's happening, right? So the thing about the evaluation is that well, the evaluation could be immediate, right, or it could come after a while. So you're playing a game of chess, right? You might make your bad move could be the 4th move in the game, but you might lose the game after 15 moves, right? So it doesn't mean that the last move you made is the one that cost you to lose, right? So it could be delayed, and it could be pretty noisy as well, right? So you might not get the so you might actually make a wrong move with your joystick with the helicopter, but then the wind conditions might be very favorable, so that you don't actually see too much of a change in your position. So that could be pretty noisy. So all of these things you'll have to factor in, right? And the goal of the agent is to maximize a measure of long-term performance, right? I'm not just interested in immediate gains, because I might get a large reward, right, a large evaluation from the environment for my action, but that might put me in a really bad situation that I may not be able to recover from later, right? So it's like that going out on that all night binge drinking spree before your exam, right? So it might give you a very good high on that night, but then it might put you from a very bad situation that you'll never recover again, right? So yeah, so we are interested in maximizing a measure of long-term performance, right? So just to reiterate again, it's really not supervised learning, right? In supervised learning, you have an input and you know what the target is, and then you can form some kind of a measure of the error, and then you can take the gradient of that error and try to adjust your parameters and so on and so forth. But here I really don't have a target. Nobody is giving me a target, right? I only have some kind of an evaluation. Hey, you crashed, right? My target would have been what is the right angle to which I should tilt my joystick, right? So that's not what I get, and then consequently I really don't have a proper error measure that I can use. What I really have to do in this case is essentially have to do some kind of exploration so that I can estimate the gradient, right? So I told you one reason for doing exploration, which is to figure out if there is a better solution, right? So I'm in some situation now. So essentially what I have to do is perturb my solution a little bit, okay, and figure out which direction of perturbation changes the solution more favorably, and then move in that direction, right? So I have to do this exploration not only to find better solutions, but also to find the direction in which to move to find those better solutions, right? And the other thing which I already reiterated, the action chooses the next state. So in some sense the next input that you are going to see is chosen by the action, right? And it's also not unsupervised learning, because unsupervised learning you are essentially looking at some kind of pattern detection, but here you have a supervision, right? In some sense your goal is to maximize the reward, maximize the evaluation you are getting in the long run, and if you have to detect patterns in the input to do that, so be it, right? But that is not the primary goal, right? You might actually want to understand the world a little bit better, organize it, find patterns so that you can react properly to the future inputs, but that's not the primary goal, right? So your goal is to maximize the reward, right? So here's a mini summary slide. So what is reinforcement learning? It's learning about your sensory input and actions based basically on rewards and punishments that you are getting from the world, right? And there's no detailed supervision that is available, and so crucially trial and error learning. So you have to worry about exploration versus exploitation. So when I get the 2 units of cheese, do I stop there and keep going there every time to exploit that knowledge, or should I explore some more and try to get that 5 units of cheese, right? And so we have to take a sequence of actions are needed to obtain the actual reward or payoff, right? And you have to associate actions to states. Some kind of associative learning is needed, so it's not one shot, right? And then consequently you learn about policies, you know. So if you are here, what should you do? If you are here, what should you do? That's essentially you are learning this whole mapping as opposed to individual actions. You're not learning is this a good action to do or is this a good action to do, but you actually have to learn a policy. This is mapping from states to action, okay? And all of this typically in a stochastic world, okay? So any questions so far? It's just the basic intro.
At each step there is no evaluation, right?
Could be, could not be. I mean, we are not expecting there to be a payoff in every step, right? Sometimes there could be a payoff in every step. For example, typically in many control problems, so there is a cost for applying a control. So as whenever you apply a control, there could be a cost. And there could also be a final goal that you are interested in achieving, some kind of a stable equilibrium. So you might get a evaluation for achieving that. You might get a reward. You might get, say, plus 100 on achieving that. But every step along the way, you might have to pay a little cost. Okay. So let's try to, yeah, sorry.
When you said explore, so are we assuming that this kind of solves only closed word problems?
Sorry.
Closed word problems.
Good question. So a lot of the work in reinforcement learning has implicitly assumed closed world. Right? There are some recent works that are looking at open world assumptions. Right, so where you keep your state space growing, right? So you don't assume that your state space is what is given to you initially. So in which case exploration becomes even more crucial, right? But then there's not too much work on reinforcement learning in open world, but there is some. Yeah, people have thought about it, but not too much. Most of the literature assumes you are in a closed world. Okay, so moving on. So let's try to nail things down a little bit. So we're going to assume that the agent and environment interact in some kind of lockstep at discrete time intervals, right? And these are not real time. Okay, it's just that the times at which an agent has to make a decision, the time at which the agent senses the world and has to make a decision, right? So each one of those time instants could actually correspond to varying real time, right? We are not worried about that right now. Right. So the agent observes the state at time t, and let's call it st, right, and produces an action at time t, cat, okay, and it gets a reward which we'll denote as rt plus 1, okay, for notational convenience. So the reward that you get when you observe a state at time t and perform an action at time t is labeled rt plus 1. Okay, that's just this small disconnect, but it makes it convenient to write some of the other expressions later, right? And then the next state that results in is st plus 1. Okay. So rt plus 1 could also be a function of st plus 1 sometimes. So there's another reason to label index it as rt plus 1. So you can think of it as a state transition like this. So you have an st, so you perform at, you get a reward rt plus 1, and then you move to state st plus 1. You keep going continuously, right? So what do we mean by the state here, and what do we mean by an action, or even what do we mean by a unit of time here, right? This is a considerable leeway in how you choose to model the problem, right? And getting the degree of abstraction right, okay, is a big issue. So for example, just think about a human driving a car, right? So where is the interface between the agent and the environment? So is the agent in the brain sending impulses to the legs and the hands to move the steering wheel and the brake and accelerator, or is the agent the entire human, right? In which case, should I press the accelerator now? Should I turn the wheel left? Those are the kind of actions that you are worried about, right? Or is the agent the car? Okay, so is it the car moving left, right, or is it going to hit a pedestrian? So those are the kinds of issues that I have to bother about. It's the same problem, right? You are driving a car, right? You are a human driving the car. So where do you think you are drawing the line? Probably at all the places. You are probably working at all those levels of abstractions at the same time, right? So, but when you want to actually capture it as a computational problem, so you have to think a little bit about where you draw the line. So that's one important modeling question. So I mean, there's a lot of work in this, even in the psychology literature, less so in computer science, more in other biological sciences and medical sciences and so on and so forth. And so the one thing to note is, I'm not saying that the environment is not known to the known to the agent, right? It's only that the agent should not be able to control the environment, and neither should it be able to control the rewards arbitrarily. Okay? The agent should be required to perform certain actions in order to get the reward. You can't just say that, okay, give me a reward now, right? So you know what happens in that case? Your agent becomes a drug addict, right? So what happens when humans inject themselves with drugs is that they get the reward chemical for free without doing anything, right? So there is this neuromodulator in the brain which is associated with these reward signals, the happiness chemical. So you inject yourself with drugs, so you get those happiness chemicals without having to work very hard for it, right? So you could also build a drug addicted reinforcement learning agent if you are not careful in how you set things up, right? Yeah. So what is the agent trying to do? The agent is trying to learn what we call a policy, right? At every time step, it's learning a mapping from the states to actions. And if you want to think of this as being stochastic, you could think of the agent learning a distribution over the actions for every state. Right? So the simpler case is to assume that a deterministic policy where for every state the agent identifies one action that it needs to take. Right? For most of the discussions, we'll assume that you are working with deterministic policies, but I'll tell you that it's a cheat, because in reality you always have to work with stochastic policies, right? And so what reinforcement learning algorithms or reinforcement learning methods really tell you is how you change these policy over time, okay, as a function of the rewards that you are getting. Right? So this reinforcement learning is not a single algorithm, right? It's a whole paradigm. Okay, it's a class of algorithms. Reinforcement learning is actually a problem. Okay, and you have a whole class of algorithms, and they basically tell you how to change the policy as a result of the experience and the rewards that you are getting. Okay, so the agent is trying to get as much reward as it can over the long run. So what we mean by before that, let's ask this question. So far, I didn't explicitly state this, but I've been assuming that the rewards that you're going to get is a scalar signal, right? Some kind of a number, right? Even the cheese, I change it into 5 and 2 and so on and so forth, right? So it's just some kind of a number that you're going to get, and is that a good enough representation for reward? Right? Do you think of your life in terms of numbers? Maybe not explicitly. Maybe there's something that's. It actually turns out that it's a pretty robust. Measure. In fact, one of the homework exercises I give when I teach the reinforcement learning course is to come up with situations where the scalar reward is absolutely inadequate, right? And it turns out to be pretty hard. So I'll give that to you also as a thought exercise for. Not pay attention to the rest of the talk, but afterwards, right? Think about situations where you can't use a scalar reward, right? And so I've been saying long-term measure of reward. So what do I really mean by that, right? So if I'm going to be playing games, right, or running mazes and stuff like that, I know for sure that at some point this thing will end. Games will end at some point, right? Mazes will end at some point. I know that it can't go on indefinitely. So then what I can do is I can just add up all the rewards that I'm going to get. Okay, and let's say so all the rewards from here to the future, right, till the end of episode. I can't say from to infinity and beyond because my rewards will get unbounded then, right? So it has to be at some point I have to cut it off, and I'll use that as my notion of what we call return. Okay, so reward is what you get at an instantaneous interaction, and return is what you get accumulating it over time. Okay, and so what happens if I don't have natural episodes? What happens if I have continuing tasks? So I need some mechanism by which I can have my return well defined, because just summing them up won't work. So what we do is we use a discount rate, right, that lies between 0 and 1. Right? And in fact, you can include 0 there, which means that you are only worried about the immediate reward, you are not worried about the future. And 1 puts you back in the just sum up the reward space. Right? So continuing task. So in sometimes what happens, you have like goals of maintenance. Right? So I'm interested in maintaining a system in a stable state. Right? So in such case, I don't have a natural end. You know, it might end, but it could be an indeterminate time in the future at which it will end. So in which case, I don't really want to keep adding it up because things might become very large. Okay. So this is one motivation for looking at discounted rewards. But there is another motivation which the economists have explored tremendously, and so have psychologists, and which is essentially how short-sighted or far-sighted you are in your decision making. Like the humans can only look so far ahead, right? So if you set your gamma to 1, that means I am looking at the entire future that unfolds before me, right? But usually you don't, right? You only pay attention to a certain horizon into the future, right? So this gamma essentially controls how short-sighted or far-sighted you are. So even in tasks that have natural episodes, you might want to use a gamma that is less than 1 to model this kind of a trade-off between short-sightedness and far-sightedness. In fact, there is an interesting experiment that people have done, which is pretty scary. It essentially tells you how much of a chemically controlled being that you are. Okay, so they trained humans to perform on some kind of a selection task. Okay, so one choice gives you a reward immediately or within a very few time steps. Another choice takes you a long time, but then you get a lot more reward. Okay, so the humans, normal humans, play this game for a while, and then they figure out that, hey, I should take the long-term choice, and then they keep picking that. Okay, so once a human has completely learned that the long-term choice is good, they go in and artificially suppress a specific neurotransmitter, neuromodulator in the brain called serotonin. Okay, they artificially suppress the serotonin, and almost immediately, magically, within a couple of trials, the humans switch to the quicker rewarding action. They know that taking the other action will give them a larger reward because they have just been trained, right? But just because this chemical got turned off, they are not able to go choose that. They actually choose the short-term action. So there is something that really controls the horizon at which you are making decision, and it's chemical. Okay, it's not metaphysical. Okay, so it's sometimes scary. So how much of what we think is higher plane consciousness, well, reduces to a different science. Right. So here's an example that kind of makes it clearer about the continuing return and the episodic return. So here is a very famous problem called the cart pole problem. So you have a pole, inverted pendulum on a cart, okay, and it's hinged at the base. So if you leave it normally, it will just fall down. So your goal is to move the cart left or right, so that you can keep the pole balanced. Okay. So I can treat this as an episodic task. When the pole falls over, the episode ends. Right. That's the end of it. Or I can treat this as a continuing task. So whenever the pole falls over, I give you a -1, but otherwise you can just keep going. Right. So if it falls over, you get a -1, and then I put the pole back up again, and then you keep going. And the idea is to make sure that the gaps between your -1s are as long as possible. In fact, infinite. Right. But so what we do? Oops, sorry. What we do is, in this case, as long as in the episodic case, as long as I keep it up, I give it a reward of 1. Right. So the return will be the number of steps before failure. Right. And in the discounted case, I'll give a -1 on failure, 0 otherwise, and the return would be minus k power gamma. Is that right? There's an error on the slide. I always I deliberately leave the error in to see if people catch it. Yeah, 0 otherwise is fine. If I fail, it gives me -1. Otherwise, I just get no reward, nothing, no feedback. It's a continuing task, right? So it can't be just minus gamma power k. It should be minus gamma power k1, minus gamma power k2, minus gamma power k3, whenever. So k1 is the first time it fell over, k2 is the second time it fell over, k3 the third time it fell over. So it's actually an infinite sum, right? With the k's becoming larger and larger and larger. Okay. But in either case, in this particular problem, the return is maximized by avoiding failure as long as possible. But there are other subtle cases where choosing one over the other makes a difference. Okay. But you can see the way the rewards. So you can, when I wanted as an episodic task, I was basically rewarding it +1 for every time it was doing well. And in this case, it was 0 for all the times it was doing well, and a -1 when it did badly. It's kind of like a dual of the reward, right? Okay. So So far I've been talking about state without really telling you what the state is, and I'm sure that all of you have had some mental picture of what the state is, right? So if you're playing a game, it looks like all the board positions. If you're flying the helicopter, the state of the helicopter, and so on and so forth. So the state is essentially, we're going to assume that whatever information that you need, okay, to make a decision at that point, so all of that is rolled into the state, right? So knowing something more about what has happened in the world other than what the state tells you is not going to help you, okay, make a better decision. Okay, so that's the assumption we have about the state, right? So essentially, so what is the probability of the next state, right, and what is the probability of the next reward given the entire sequence of everything that has happened from the beginning of time? Okay, it's the same as the probability of the next state and reward given the current state and the current action, right? I don't care. Once I know what the current state is, I don't care what happened before that. So most of you should be familiar. That's the Markov property, right? So once I have the Markov property, and essentially if you think about it, what we are doing is solving a decision problem. So once we have this kind of a Markov decision problem, right, so we can actually go and model this as a Markov decision process. So this is the standard abstraction that most reinforcement learning algorithms use. Okay. In fact, it has had a detrimental effect in the community in some sense, because a lot of people started mistaking the model for the world, right? So now there is this whole movement as to getting away from Markov decision processes and trying to think of richer models of the world. But for good or bad, a lot of the theoretical development that you will see in the algorithmic development that you will see in the community have been assuming these are Markov decision processes, right? So here you're going to make a further assumption for at least part of the talk is that the states and action sets are finite. Okay, so you don't really have a infinite number of states or continuous states, and also the action sets is finite and small. And so essentially we are in the case of a finite MDP, which makes the theory a lot easier and cleaner, and so you don't have to make too many additional assumptions about the MDP in order to show certain results. Right? And so a finite MDP is essentially characterized by the set of states and actions, which we denote as S and A, and the one-step dynamics of the problem, right, which is essentially the probability of the next state being S prime, given the current state is S and the current action is A, because that's all we need with Markov, right? The one-step dynamics are sufficient, and also the reward expectations, right? So we are not talking about the reward distribution here. I'm talking about the reward expectation. Why? Yeah, but why am I not talking about the distributions? Right? See, here I'm talking about the next state distributions, but in the reward case, I'm saying it is sufficient for you to specify the expectations alone. No, but the thing is, I am interested in maximizing only the expected return. Right? I'm interested in maximizing the expected return. So as long as I have access to this expectation, reward expectation, I can use the linearity of expectation, and I can write down the expected return as well. Right? So I don't really need to know the distribution of the reward, but increasingly to derive more efficient reinforcement learning algorithms, people have started paying attention to the reward distribution as well. Right? So knowing the reward distribution allows you to come up with better exploration strategies that allow you to learn more efficiently. Okay? But classically, people did not look at the reward distribution; they were only looking at the expectation. Okay? So that essentially characterizes the MDP: the states, action, the one-step dynamics, and the reward expectations. Okay, so here's an example. So it's a bane of reinforcement learning. This is called the grid world. So a lot of early work in reinforcement learning until about 5-6 years back, maybe about a decade ago, right? Almost all the demonstrations and other things that you would see were on grid worlds. Right? Very simple dynamics. So each cell here is a state. Okay, if the cell is shaded, that means you can't move into that, so it's not a valid state. Right? You can think of it as an obstacle. Right? And then you have 4 actions: north, south, east, and west. In this case, go up, down, left, or right. And so you could define the rewards in whatever way you want. You could say that there is a -1 per time step, right? Or you could say there is a 1 when you reach the goal, and 0 elsewhere, and then you have a discount factor that is less than 1. So you could think of different ways of defining the reward function. Right. So let's take a more complex example. So what would be the state in the backgammon? Right. If you think of this current situation, so I can say that, say maybe white has rolled a 5 and a 2, right, and so this is the position on the board. So this is all where the pieces are, and black has one person who is on the bar, right. So I can think of the state as being defined like that, right, just by the board position and the die roll, right. But the state could actually be arbitrarily complex. So in fact, if you think about it, this state satisfies our Markov property in some sense, right. I know what the board position is, I know the die roll, so I can tell you what the distribution over the next move is going to be. So that it satisfies the Markov assumption, but somehow it's just too complex a state space for you to learn anything useful from. And Jerry Tesaro never did get this to learn with this kind of a representation. So in fact, he used a set of highly processed features, right. So the number of points made. So this is like a, so this is maybe you make a point, basically you have occupied it. Your opponent cannot land there. So if you're sitting alone, the opponent can cut you. But if there are 2 of your pieces on it, the opponent cannot cut you, he can't land there. So it's basically something that is excluded to the opponent. So how many such points do you have, and how many, so blots are pieces that are all by themselves. So how many blots you have, and so those kinds of more complex features we computed on the backgammon board and use that as your feature vector, as your state description of your state. Okay. So Tesaro's assumption was that he is doing things in a very comprehensive fashion, such that this 192 features that he is defining is sufficient to describe the state. Okay, so that's essentially how he went about doing it. So you could think of different ways of characterizing state. So now I have the state, I have the actions, probabilities, and then the rewards. So how do I go about solving this problem? Okay. So I have to introduce you to one of the crucial concepts that people in reinforcement learning use, which is the notion of a value function. The value function is nothing but the expected return, right. But then return is something that is tied to a behavior, right. So because the return depends on the states and the actions, so depending on what actions I take, so the returns would change, right. So essentially what I now do is define a value function that is tied to a policy pi, right. So v pi of s is essentially the expected return I am going to get starting from state S and following policy pi from there on. So this essentially in some sense tells me how valuable it is to reach a particular state, because once I reach the state, right, I know how to behave according to my policy pi, so that I'll get that much return at least. Okay, so this essentially attaches a utility to the states. So depending on what formulation you are using, you can just use the some return, right. So likewise, we also write a utility or value function for actions. Okay, this is a state action value function. So it tells me, okay, what is the expected return I am going to get, assuming I start in a state S, I do some action A, arbitrary action A, but from the next state onwards, I will follow my policy pi. Does that make sense? So the first action I do does not necessarily conform with my policy pi. It could be the action given by pi, it could be a different action. But from the next state onwards, I will follow policy pi. So what is the expected return I am going to get? Okay. So why is this needed? We will see a little bit later. But having this kind of action value function lets you compare individual actions in a given state. Because at the end of the day, what you are supposed to do is pick an action given a state, right? And you need a mechanism for comparing the actions in a given state. Okay. Okay. Is it clear? So you have to get the notions of value function clear before we proceed further. Everyone on board, both the value function, right? At least those who are. Which one here? So it will be the action suggested by the policy pi. Okay, so policy pi is defined for all states. So for the current state, whatever is the action specified by pi, you take that. And for subsequent states as well. So in the Q function, for the current state, you will pick that action A that you have that you are considering, and subsequently you will be following actions according to pi.
This policy pi is a probability distribution.
Could be, it could be deterministic, could be stochastic. Yeah.
So it's
Either way.
given by policy pi.
Sorry.
Policy pi is given by
It's a, it's a policy, an arbitrary policy under consideration. So how will you determine this? We'll see later, right? I mean, the algorithm for actually determining a sequence of policies pi, we'll look at it a little later. But right now, given some arbitrary policy pi, I am defining a value function.
So we need to determine this pi.
Eventually, yes. But also, given a pi, finding out how good it is also a useful thing to know. Sometimes your policy is fixed, you have no freedom of action. At least at that point, you should know which are the good states, which are the bad states. Evaluating the policy itself is non-trivial problem. Okay, so people are clear. I mean, everyone, at least people who are awake. There is really no good reason for Q standing for the action values. Okay, in fact. Different communities use Q for different things. Okay, so it was there's a guy Chris Watkins who came up with this algorithm called Q learning. Okay, and this was like '89, and so he decided to use the notation Q for the state action, for the action value function, and it just stuck. Okay, so if you think about the return, right? So you can write it in a recursive fashion. So the return at time t, right, is RT plus 1 plus gamma RT plus 2 plus gamma squared RT plus 3 and so on and so forth. So I can think of it as writing it as RT plus 1 plus gamma times capital RT plus 1. Make sense, right? So now I can go and look at the value function equation. So that I can now write it as RT plus 1 plus gamma times the value of the next state that I am going to land up in. Right? So it's RT plus 1 gamma times capital RT plus 1, and the expectation of capital RT plus 1 is value of the next state. Anyway, that's how we have defined the value function, right? So the value function is the expectation of the return. So the expectation of the return at t plus 1 would be the value of the state at time t plus 1. Does it make sense? It's a fairly straightforward thing. So the only thing I want you to think about is, why have I still left it within the expectation? If V of St plus 1 is the expected value of RT plus 1, right, why is it in the expectation still? It depends on St plus 1, right? So St plus 1 itself is picked by a distribution. So it's I still have to look at the expected value of V of St plus 1, because St plus 1 is actually a random variable. Okay, so I have partly written out the expectation, but still the residual uncertainty is there. Okay, good. So without the expectation operator, I can write it out like this. So if you remember the notation, this is the probability that the next state is S prime, given the current state is yes, the action you took is A. Right? And the set of equations like these are known as Bellman equations, after Richard Bellman, who came up with these in the 60s. Right? And depending on which community you come from, sometimes they are known as Poisson equations, and I mean, there are a whole bunch of different names for this. Let me not get in there, but we will call them Bellman equations after the book. Okay. Right, so this is clear how this comes about. So this is, you can see that this is essentially a set of linear equations, right? So how many unknowns? As many as there are states, right? How many equations? As many as there are states, right? Right. So for every v of v pi of s, I'll have one equation like this, right? And on the right hand side, you will see that all the v pi of s appear. So essentially, it's, suppose there are n states, you have n equations and n unknowns, and with a little bit of work, you can show that this is actually all non-redundant equations, and you can solve this set of linear equations and get a solution. You can always find a V pi, right? And not only that, since this is a completely determined system, so V pi will be unique. Okay, there will be only one V pi. So for a given policy pi for finite MDPs, the V pi will always be unique. Okay. Right. So here's an example, and let me skip that. We're running out of time. Not running out, but yeah, I'm on slide 30 out of slide 60. So let me try to push along. Right. So it turns out that for finite MDPs, you can show that the policies are partially ordered, right? So pi, where the ordering is given by this, right? Pi is greater than or equal to pi prime, if and only if V pi of s is greater than V pi prime of s for all s. Right? So you could think of policies pi where for some of the states it's higher, for some of the states it's lesser, and so on and so forth. But then I'm not going to really prove it now. It takes a little bit of work. But there is at least one policy such that, so V pi star of s is greater than or equal to V pi of s for all s and all pi. Okay, there is at least one policy which will be essentially the supremum in your lattice, right? So you have a partial order, you can always find out this supremum. And so here is an example of going back to MDP. Let's assume that I have to reach the goal, right? So that is a trajectory followed by an optimal policy, right? Starting from here, okay, that policy is optimal, but so is this policy, right? It takes the least number of steps to get to the goal. In fact, so are these policies. There are lots and lots of different policies which are optimal in this simple grid world, and it turns out in more complex situations, I mean, the things are more complicated. You have lot more optimal policies, right? But what is shared among all these optimal policies is the fact that the value function corresponding to each of these policies will be the same. So what will be the value function here? So suppose the value of this state will be the number of steps it's going to take me to reach to the goal from here, right? Gamma power the number of steps that will take me to reach to the goal, right? Or if you are using -1 for every step, it will be minus of the number of steps it will take me to reach to the goal, right? So from here, right, according to the blue policy, it will be 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. According to the green policy, it will be 10. Right? According to the red policy, well, we don't have a red policy defined there, but if we had one defined there, that will also be 10. Right? So it doesn't matter what optimal policy you are following, but the optimal value function has to be the same. Intuitively, you can see that. If it is not the same, then it can't be optimal. Right? Right? So we can go back now and write a optimal version of the Bellman equation. Right? If you remember the Bellman equation, it had right, so the expectation was taken over pi as well, right? The expectation was taken over pi as well. So here what I do is I remove the expectation over pi, and I'm saying the max action, right, in this particular state, which is the action that gives me the maximum value. Okay, so I'm going to take that action. So in some sense what I am saying is I am going to look ahead one step, right? I am just looking ahead one step. If you think about it, I am looking ahead one step and then trying to be optimal or trying to be greedy with respect to that look ahead. Right? So I will take one step forward, I will see what is the reward I am going to get and what is the value in the next step, next state I am going to have, and among all possible options that I have at this step, and I will pick the one that is maximum. Right? And I am going to say that, okay, if from then on I am going to behave optimally. Okay, so that's what this V star S prime says. Okay, so I'll take one step, I'll look at the reward, and from there on I'm going to behave optimally. Okay, so which is the best one step choice I should make? Right? That is going to give me what is the optimal way to behave in this current state. So this is a recursive way of defining it, but that's essentially what gives us this Bellman equation, right? So because we have this max in here, these equations are no longer linear. Okay, so you have to come up with other mechanisms for solving them, right? Some kind of iterative methods for solving them, and you can show that this actually defines an iterative procedure which is a contraction mapping. So if people are interested, I can show that, but or we can do this offline, which has a unique fixed point, right? So essentially that says that V star is a solution to this system of nonlinear equations. Two things you can show easily for finite MDPs: A, such a solution exists, and B, such a solution is unique, right? This you can show easily for finite MDPs. Okay, if you are going to start looking at MDPs with continuous states, then you'll have to start making specific assumptions about the state space under certain technical conditions. Then you can show that such a policy would exist. For finite MDPs, it's rather straightforward. Okay, so any questions on the optimal equation? Okay, so we can write one for Q as well. So note here that the max has gone inside the summation, because at this stage you really have no choice, because Q you always have to perform the action A specified in the Q function, but for the subsequent actions you can be greedy. Okay, so therefore your max moves into the summation, and again Q star is the unique solution for the system of nonlinear equations, right? So suppose I tell you that this is V star. Somehow I have solved this system of equations. I have solved this system of equations, and I tell you that this is my V star, right? Now can you tell me how to behave in this world? What is the optimal policy in this world? The answer is on the slide, but if I can solve those system of equations and give you a V star, now you can tell me what is the best way to behave in the world. Right? Earlier people are asking how do you find the policy, right? Now I am telling you, find V star, you can find the policy. How do you do that? So basically you just have to be greedy with respect to one step look ahead on V star, right? So I am here, right? What are the directions I could move? I could go up, left, right, down, right? And each one of these is going to give me a reward of 0, right? So here this grid world, all the rewards are zeros except these two things that are indicated by an arc, and there's a gamma of 0.9. Okay, so each of these actions is going to give me a reward of 0, but then I'm going to get 22 from there by behaving optimally, right? 17.8 from here, 17.8 from here, 17.8 from here. So what I really need to do is here go up. Right? So likewise from here I can see, so of my 3 neighbors, 2 are equally valuable, right? So essentially here I can say, okay, I can either go up or go right. So whichever choice I make, it's optimal. In fact, I can choose this with any probability, it's still optimal. I can say with probability 0.8 I'll go up, with probability 0.2 I'll go right. It's still optimal. So what is the nice thing here? Once I know V star, all I need to do is do this one step look ahead. I don't care about the rest of the state space. How do I behave in the current state? Just do a one step look ahead, right? So there might be a larger sequence of actions that I need to take to achieve this reward, right? But since I'm giving you the guarantee that I'm being greedy with respect to V star, at any point of time I just need to do this one step look ahead and I get the right policy. So that's the nice thing about having access to V star, right? But there's still a problem. What's the problem? Yeah, but fine, given the V star, I still, so given the V star, there's still an issue that we need to resolve. So one thing that we need to really think about is, well, how do I know to get from here to there? How do I know what are the right actions to take, right? Or if I take an action, how do I know what is the outcome of that? So I need to know that completely specified, right? I need to have that completely specified for me before I can actually take an action according to V star, right? Well, you can always argue, hey, you needed that to be specified to find V star in the first place, but I'll talk about methods where you can find V star without knowing the dynamics. Okay, you can just do it through sampling, right? So this is where our action values are going to help us. So if I had found out Q star instead of finding V star, if I had computed Q star, right? So again I had this set of equations, I can solve this and I can find Q star, right? Then my optimal action is just the by being greedy with respect to the current action set, right? I don't even have to do a look ahead to the next state. I just look around all the actions in the current state, whichever has the highest value I take it. So that's very convenient, I can execute that, right? Good. So how do I find V star? So here we have the Bellman optimality equation. I can just turn it up into a backup equation, right? I start with some guess for my V, okay, then do this computation, whatever comes out I'll use that as my next value, next iteration value for V, right? So V0 can start off with all zeros, right? So V1 will be the one step reward, right? Now I'll plug that in and then try to compute V2, then I'll plug that in, try to compute V3 and so on and so forth. And because of the fact that this is a contraction mapping, I'm sorry, there should be a gamma there, I missed out a gamma. Because of the fact that this is a contraction mapping, this will converge to the optimal value function. So this algorithm is called value iteration, and it's a workhorse in many of the OR literature, operations research, where they try to solve these kinds of decision problems. They use typically value iteration a lot, right? So it's fairly straightforward, right? There's no questions about how you compute V star, right? So here I put convergence within quotes. So why? Huh? Sorry, louder please. I heard a lot of murmurs, but I didn't hear anything intelligible. Why have I put convergence within quotes? It won't go into loop. I told you it's a contraction mapping. It won't go into loop. It will converge. It may take a long time to converge. Okay. So subsequent iterates could vary by as little as 10 power minus 4, 10 power minus 5. Right? If I'm going to look at perfect convergence, that may never happen, right? Or not happen in our lifetime. So at some point we're just going to set a threshold, right? Some small epsilon. Okay. So from one iteration to the other, if the change in the value function is below an epsilon, I'll just stop.
Is it like almost convergence?
No. This will converge. Okay, it's not even almost here. For finite MDPs, you get absolute convergence, right? But then you just stop because it just takes a long time. You stop at a point and then decide this is it, right? So I want to build up towards another very popular way of solving these equations. So the first step we will look at is something called policy evaluation. So here is a Bellman equation for V pi, and you can solve it, right? We already discussed about this. This is a system of S simultaneous equations. You can solve it. You can with whatever your favorite approach. You can solve it iteratively. You can solve it in one shot. Whatever you solve it, right? Now let's ask this question. So I have computed V pi. Now can I answer this? For a given state S, when would it be better for me to do an action A that is not suggested by my policy pi? Let's assume that we are sticking with deterministic policies for the time being, but when it would be better for me to do an action A that is not suggested by pi, right? So basically, if the Q value for doing action A is greater than the current value for the state, right, then I can do action A instead of pi of S. Right? If you think about it, what is V pi of S? It's Q pi of right? V pi of S is Q pi of S comma pi of S. So as long as Q pi S of A is greater than Q pi S pi of S, I can do A over pi of S, right? So what do? Now I define a new policy pi prime that essentially is the argmax over q pi of s. Right. So this is essentially being greedy with respect to the value function. Right. I will be greedy with respect to one step look ahead on the value function. That gives me a new policy pi prime. Right. So now what I can say for sure is v pi prime is greater than v pi, because at every step I compared it with the action suggested by pi, right, and I found an action that is at least as good as that or better. Right. I have done this for every state. Okay. Therefore I can say that v pi prime is greater than or equal to v pi. Right. But we could come to a situation where v pi prime is equal to v pi. At every step I am better. Okay. At some point I have to hit this equality constraint. So what does that mean? That means that v pi prime of s is equal to max over a, the summation p ss prime a r ss prime a plus gamma times v pi of s prime. Okay, that looks very suspiciously like the Bellman optimality equation, right? What is different there? Well, one side we have pi, one side we have v pi prime, right? But we already said that the solution to the Bellman optimality equation is unique, right? So if there is a value function that satisfies these, then they have to be the same and they have to be equal to the optimal value function. So if my iterative process comes to a point where v pi prime is equal to v pi, then I have reached the optimal value function, and either pi or pi prime, I can take either one of them, they have to be the optimal policy, right? So this algorithm is called policy iteration. So I start off with some arbitrary policy pi naught, okay, I do the evaluation, I get v pi naught, and then I do the policy improvement step, which is the greedification step, the argmax step, so I get pi 1, I keep iterating this until I come to a point where the subsequent value functions look the same. Okay. And in a finite MDP, this is guaranteed to converge in a finite number of iterations, because there are only finitely many policies. Okay. So we have to hit the optimal policy quickly, and you will never run into cycles because you are guaranteed that every step your policy is better than the strictly, I mean not strictly better than the previous step, right, except at terminal condition where we will have the optimal policy, right. So there is a more aggressive version of policy iteration called generalized policy iteration, where you can interleave this policy evaluation step where you go from pi to v and the policy improvement step where you go from v to pi, being greedy. You can interleave them at any number of iterations. Okay, you don't have to do the full solution of v pi or fully greedify from pi to pi prime. I can just select a subset of the states, okay, and then I can try to do my estimation of the value function only in those subset of the states, and then improve the policy only in those subset of the states. This is called generalized policy iteration, and it turns out that many of the reinforcement learning algorithms we will look at fall under the gamut of generalized policy iteration. Okay, and that gives us all kinds of nice convergence guarantees, because we know that generalized policy iteration converges, and so as soon as you can show that your learning algorithm falls under the same framework as generalized policy iteration, you get convergence for free, right? So you don't have to worry about showing anything further. Okay, so far we have been talking about class of techniques called stochastic dynamic programming. They are not really classically RL techniques, right? So they have been around for much longer than people have been studying reinforcement learning. They are called stochastic dynamic programming for solving MDPs, right? All this value iteration, policy iteration, and so the problems with this kind of STP techniques is that they require complete knowledge of the system dynamics, basically our P and R. You need to know that fully, right? And it's expensive and often not practical, because you are expending, you're basically looking at all the states in your environment, okay, and treating them as equal. Even states that you might not ever visit at all. When you are executing your optimal policy, some parts of the state space might never be visited, right? But when you are solving this using this kind of value iteration or policy iteration, you will be paying equal attention to all of these states, right? But the nice thing is these are guaranteed to converge. On the other hand, so reinforcement learning methods, we will see a few of those now, can be thought of as online approximate dynamic programming techniques, right? and they work on sample trajectories through the state space. You don't need knowledge of P and R. You can work with samples of transitions to the state space. I mean, of course, the richer the sample, the better your solution is going to be, but you don't need to know P and R a priori. Right? And of course, some theoretical convergence analysis available, but there is no free lunch. So once you move to this sample-based scenario, so it's a little harder coming up with properly convergent algorithms. Okay, good. So here is a pictorial description of what dynamic programming does. Okay, think of this as a world tree. You know, so all possible, not from out there, but all possible outcomes of something that could happen. You know, so you have state here. Okay, then you could do some action, and then basically you act according to pi, and then you could have multiple outcomes that are possible. So if you think of what dynamic programming is doing, is taking an expectation over all possible outcomes. Right, you're taking all possible branches that your world can take from your current state, right, considering all of these, and then looking at the update that would result from considering all of these. Right. On the other hand, the simplest reinforcement learning technique that we are going to look at will be only looking at a sample, right, instead of looking at this entire tree, right, and just looking at one possible realization through that space of possibilities. Okay. So I mean, state S, okay, I do some action, I end up getting a reward of RT plus 1, and then I end up in some state ST plus 1. Okay. So if you think about what dynamic programming does, it considers all possibilities of this to happen. What I am saying we will do in reinforcement learning is that we will just take one sample, right, and then we will update the estimate of the value function as follows. Okay. So I will take my current estimate of the value function, which is what I have at V of st, okay, and then look at what is the best guess I can do for the value function given the current sample. Right. So I know that RT plus 1 I have acquired, right, and I also know that from the next state onwards, okay, I can get VST plus 1, because I have already estimated that. So from the next state ST plus 1 I can get VST plus 1. So I know that is the return. Right. So I just say that, okay, I will take RT plus 1 plus VST plus 1, so that is the target. Okay. What is my current guess? That is VST. So I am going to take the target minus the current guess, that gives me the error in my prediction, right, and add that to my current prediction. Right. This is a very classical stochastic averaging kind of technique. So I take the current prediction, okay, and add the error in the prediction to it, and hopefully that will give me a better prediction. Is that clear? So why am I not adding the error all the way? I am only adding a small fraction here, because the estimate of the error is also stochastic, right? So so the next time I come, I might draw a different sample, so I will get a different estimate for the reward for the error, and therefore I only add a small fraction. I move my estimate a small fraction towards the new estimate. Okay, so it's essentially a stochastic averaging rule, where I take my old estimate, add the error in the prediction, and then get my new estimate from that. Okay, did that make sense to people? Yes, great. So this method is called the temporal difference method. So it's a very simple rule. It turns out that it explains a lot of complex behavior that we see in animals, in humans, and also it can produce pretty complex behavior dynamics even when you are implementing it on machines, right? So the intuition is, the psychological intuition behind this is that the prediction of the outcome at time t plus 1 is better than the prediction at time t, because you are closer to the end of the problem, right? Since you are closer to the end of the problem, the variance you would see in your returns is smaller, because there is less time over which your episodes run, and therefore you have a better estimate of the value at time t plus 1 than you have at time t, and therefore I can use the value at time t plus 1 as a goal for correcting my estimate at time t. So that's basically the idea. And since we are using the later prediction to adjust the earlier prediction, it is called the temporal difference error. Yeah. So we have to assume that you are drawing enough samples. So the convergence guarantee is as not only as t tends to infinity, but also as the number of samples drawn or become sufficiently representative of the world. Okay. So the condition is sometimes called the Glee condition. So the policy that you are using for learning should be greedy in the limit. Okay. At the end of time, you should be behaving greedily with respect to your value function, but while you are learning, you should have infinite exploration. So greedy in the limit with infinite exploration. So GLIE is the condition that you normally have for convergence on these kinds of algorithms, right? In this case, you are talking about value function. So you just basically have your function pi, right? As long as you are sampling all the outcomes that could come through behaving according to pi, so you should have a convergence, right? So we can talk about rates of convergence and things like that, but the convergence is guaranteed only as t tends to infinity. In this case, you don't have to worry about exploration because you have a fixed policy pi. When you are talking about v pi, so you have a fixed policy pi for which you are doing this evaluation. So all you need to do is make sure that you sample enough so that all the possible stochastic outcomes in the states could happen. So you don't have to worry about explicit exploration. But yeah, so that's there. And yeah, so it has had a profound impact in behavioral psychology and neuroscience. And in fact, this kind of TD learning is something that's accepted as a given almost in terms of explaining animal learning, right? In many circumstances, people have actually shown that there are chemicals in the brain that vary according to the predictions made by the TD algorithms, right? So it's yeah, so yeah, that simple equation might be something that's actually happening in your head, for all we know, right? And so here's another simple thing that actually was a pretty apparently was all the rage in the 60s. Okay, so there's a thing called Menace which plays tic-tac-toe, right? It stands for Matchbox Educable Noughts and Crosses Engine. This is proposed by Michie and Chambers. They actually built the physical system. This is a replica. They built a system in the 60s which had this whole set of matchboxes, okay, and each matchbox had a label that essentially describes the state of the tic-tac-toe game, okay, and then when you pull the matchbox, you will have different colored stones or beads in them, and each bead stands for an action, okay. So essentially they are storing some kind of Q value, if you think about it, right, and then they open a matchbox whenever they reach that position in the game, and then they take a bead out of it at random, and then they look at the color, and then they make a move according to that, okay. And then if you win the game, okay, they increase the number of beads of that color, okay. If you lose the game, they'll just take the bead out, okay. So this is very simple game, a very simple algorithm. It turns out to be one of the earliest reinforcement learning algorithms that was implemented. And this apparently created a huge furore. You know, these guys took their Matchbox engine around on exhibition all over UK, and people used to pay money to come and watch this play tic-tac-toe. Right, learn to play tic-tac-toe. So it's amazing. You can just take little matchboxes and beads and build a learning engine, right? In fact, there are people who have actually written apps that are online that allow you to use the same algorithm that they did. Right, but you can do something cleverer than what they did with tic-tac-toe. So what did they do? They played a full game, right, and they remembered which were the matchboxes they opened along the way, and then they figured out whether they won or not at the end, and then they went back and changed all the beads. Right, they basically played out the full game. Right, instead of that, we can use TD. Right, we can use temporal difference. Right, so at any point I make a move. Let's say I come here, right, and then I decide, hey, what is the probability of me winning from here? Right? Have I won from here in the past? What is the fraction of games I have won from here in the past? And I can use that, okay, to change my beats. Right? I don't have to wait till the end of the game to see whether I won or lost. Okay, I've already played many games in the past, so I know the average number of games I won. I can use that for modifying my probabilities. right? Probabilities of choosing different actions. So that's essentially what TD would do for us in tic-tac-toe, right? And so what are the advantages of TD? Well, I already mentioned some of this. Does not require a model of the environment, only experience, right? So this is what I was driving at. So I can start learning about the world, right, without actually finishing an episode. I can start doing learning along the way, right? So in the Menace engine, I had to finish playing the game. So tic-tac-toe, 9 moves, fine, right? What about games with longer horizons, right? So or what about other problems which are not even episodic, right? With the TD learning, I can learn before knowing the final outcome, right? So from computation point of view, this requires less peak computation, right? So in the Menace style of playing, at the end I have to update for all the states I have seen so far. So it's one shot, I'll have to do a lot of computation. Here at every time instant I'm only doing one state at a time. So there's a lot less computation and less memory as well, which is not really a concern anymore, right? In fact, you can even learn without the final outcome. This is what I was telling you. So I can look at continuing problems, I can look at incomplete, I can give you a fraction of a trajectory, right? And from that I can learn something. I don't really have to know till the end of the game. Yeah, please. Menace? Yeah?
Instead of the full this one. So instead of one branch of when you see the trajectory of not an complete
Yeah.
you go. So just wondering like instead of one branch, at a given point of time you take two comparisons and then use a delta as a temporal and then take a educated.
See, what you are really trying to approximate when you take a sample here is actually this behavior. So what I am trying to approximate is this behavior when I am taking the sample. So doing that comparison doesn't make sense in that case, right? But when I am trying to find the optimal policy, right? In such case, doing that makes sense. In fact, there is a whole set of techniques called rollout based ideas where people do exactly that. Unfortunately, I'm not going to talk about rollouts. I mean, but we can maybe talk during the break. I can tell you more about it. Right? So there are two kinds of problems that we'll talk about in reinforcement learning. One is the prediction problem. So a prediction problem is essentially the policy evaluation problem. I give you a policy pi, give me the value function. Okay. So here in the simplest TD method, okay, it's called the TD0 algorithm. So you assume that there is a policy pi, what you are estimating the value for, and that you are given a whole bunch of samples. Okay. So I don't like this fact, but the reinforcement learning community does call this bootstrapping, even though bootstrapping means something completely different from a statistics point of view. The fact that you use an earlier estimate of V to learn a new estimate of V is called bootstrapping. So, right, we already discussed this, and here is a more interesting stuff in terms of control, right? So control is the problem of learning an optimal policy, right? Prediction is the problem of evaluating a given policy. Control is the problem of learning an optimal policy, right? So what is the most natural way to learn an optimal policy? Is to try and do policy iteration, right? Once I have a mechanism for evaluating a policy, so now I have TD algorithms, I have TD0, so given a policy pi, I can find V pi. Right? Once I find V pi, I can go be greedy with respect to V pi or Q pi, whatever. I can be greedy with respect to Q pi and get a new policy. And then I can go back and evaluate that. Right? And then I can come back and be greedy with respect to that value function, evaluate it again until I converge to an optimal policy. Right? But the problem here is that I'll be evaluating a lot of intermediate policies in between, and I might need a lot of samples to do that. Right? Because every time I change my policy, I'll have to generate trajectories according to that policy, and then I'll have to use that for estimating the value. So instead of that, we can do something like generalized policy iteration. If you remember what I told you about generalized policy iteration, you take a subset of states, you evaluate the policy in that subset of states, and then you be greedy with respect to that policy in those subset of states. So what we do here is you take one state. This is the extreme form of generalized policy iteration. I'll take one state, right? So my current state, okay, I'll perform an action AT, right, and I'll update my value function for AT. Okay, this is exactly what I did in my TD0 update. I do the TD0 update for the Q function and change the value for ST80. Okay. The next time step I have to take an action. I pick an action that is greedy with respect to this current state, current value function, sorry. So I take an action that is greedy with respect to the current value function. So that's like I'm doing a policy improvement. So if I visit all the states often enough, this is where the greedy in the limit with infinite exploration I was telling you about. So you need infinite exploration so that you try out all state action combinations often enough, but then you have to eventually become greedy, otherwise you are not executing the optimal policy, right? So you have to be exploring in the beginning and eventually have to become greedy so that you get your policy improvement going, right? So that is essentially this algorithm called Sarsa. So you start off with some guess for the value function, okay, start in some state, take an action, okay, update the value function, right, then start in another state, take an action which is greedy with respect to the value function that you have, update it, right, keep going. You can't always be greedy, because if you are always greedy you don't explore all the options that are available. So greedy more often than not, but keep exploring so that you explore all the actions as many, infinitely often typically, right. So the problem with infinitely often exploration is that you can't really give good guarantees in terms of convergence rates and so on and so forth, right. So if you want to give those kinds of guarantees, you will have to start paying attention to the reward distributions, right. You will have to start paying attention to when can you not, when I don't have to take infinite number of samples, when I am sure that the action is bad, I can chop it off, right. So people are looking at more and more of such questions nowadays, right. And then there is another way of looking at control problem. So this is called Q learning. So if you think of what one way of thinking about Q learning is that it's also like a generalized policy iteration, but the easier way of thinking about it is like an iterative version of the Bellman optimality equation for Q pi. So it's like applying the Bellman optimality equation on each and every sample that I draw from the world, as opposed to doing it for all possible outcomes, right. So if I had done it for all, if you think of the value function backup, value iteration backup for Q, I would have had a summation over all possible next states here, right. So there will be a summation over all possible next states, and I would have done this, right. Since I can't run over all possible next states because I don't know all possible next states, I basically do this one sample at a time. So you can think of it like a sample version of implementing value iteration for the Q function. Okay. You can also think of this as a version of generalized policy iteration, where this max is some kind of a greedy version, the greedification thing, but the value iteration interpretation is easier to understand sometimes. So the nice thing about Q learning, if you think about it, is that it is not doing it along the trajectories that you are behaving. So if you look at Sarsa, I have to use AT plus 1 here, right. It's important that I actually pick AT plus 1 in the next time step, right. I have to be greedy with respect to it. So AT plus 1 has to be a greedy selection with respect to my current Q. Or if I am behaving in an exploratory way, it has to be that exploratory action that it took, okay, otherwise my estimates go wrong. But in Q learning, I actually have max over A, okay, it's always the greedy action. I don't care what action I take, right. When I am doing the update, I only use the greedy action, okay. So that allows me to actually not even behave in trajectories. I can give you an arbitrary just transitions. You can just take a board game, just make one move and see what the opponent responds, then throw it away, then reset the pieces, take another move. Okay, it's like that. Okay, I can be completely disconnected in terms of the experiences I'm generating, okay, and I can still run Q learning. I can't do that on Sarsa. Okay, so for this reason, algorithms like Sarsa are called on policy methods, okay, because you are learning on the policy, And algorithms like Q-learning are called off-policy methods because you are not learning on the policy. You're actually using a different update than what is suggested by the actions you're taking, right? So here's a simple example that illustrates the difference between. Okay, fine. I have 3 more slides. Guys, can you hold on? Okay, good. Here's a simple example on the difference between Sarsa and Q-learning. So here is a cliff. It's a grid world again. So if you fall off the cliff, you get a reward of -100. Okay, and then if you walk along, you get a reward of -1 per time step. So the sooner you reach the goal, the better. Right. So if you use when you are learning, I'm taking exploratory actions, right? Because otherwise I will not be exploring everything. So with the probability 0.9, I take the greedy action. With probability 0.1, I behave randomly. Okay, so that it allows me to explore all the places. Right. So what do you think will happen? While I'm learning, if I'm going to walk close to the cliff, okay, I'll keep falling down often because of that 0.1 exploration, right? So and Sarsa looks at what I'm actually doing, so it will learn to walk far away from the cliff. Right? But Q-learning assumes that you are going to behave optimally because it has the max in there. So even though you keep falling off many times while you are doing the learning, Q-learning will learn the optimal policy. It will learn to hug the cliff and go over because it assumes that finally when you use the policy, okay, you will behave optimally. You will not be having any noise. Okay, so that's an important distinction in the way Q-learning and Sarsa behave, and in some applications it could matter. But more often than not, the choice of Q-learning versus Sarsa is whichever is better behaved numerically in your application, so you choose that. But there is actually a difference in the way the 2 algorithms behave, the solutions that they get. They don't converge to the same solution. Okay.
But is it not the case that when we actually use this learning, we behave optimally?
It could be. Yeah. So it depends on the situation. I wouldn't say that you always have to behave in a noise-free fashion. Maybe having a little bit of noise is good, especially if there's this chance that your world might change in the future. So having a little bit of noise is good. And also it could very well be that your controller, suppose you're using a robot or something, your controller could be inherently noisy, so you cannot be behaving optimally. So you'll have to factor in the noise in some cases. So yeah, so that's why I said it could be. You'd like to behave optimally, but you might not be able to do that. So we looked at a bunch of things. There are other TD methods called actor critique. So we'll look at policy search when we come back a little bit. And we also looked at stochastic dynamic programming, many solution methods. We looked at a bunch of applications already, and a lot more applications. These slides will be available, you can look at it, so not much time. So so just chopping up with this slide. So scaling, so we have millions, sometimes even billions of actions. State space could be continuous. Right, so what we typically end up doing is use some kind of parametric representations. It could be of value functions, it could be of policies and other things. But mathematically, using this parametric representation for the value function, really as you doing regression on a non-stationary problem. So why is that the case? We'll look at it after the break. But so it makes it a little challenging. And the second thing is you could worry about really complex policies where you use hierarchical organization. And so some of the recent excitement in reinforcement learning is due to the successes in game playing, especially in these arcade games, Atari games, right? So I'll talk about it, maybe just this last 2 slides of this presentation, I'll do it after the break because I'm already eaten into the break, right? So after the break.